Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to this episode of What's Next Live, where I am thrilled to actually, I think, welcome my very first Pulitzer Prize winner, Charles Duhigg, to the show. He's so much more than that, but let me give you a little bit of his bio. He is a reporter and the author of The Power of Habit, which spent over 3 years on the New York Times bestseller list. I didn't make it once, by the way. He made it for 3 years. His second book, Smarter, Faster, Better, was also a bestseller. And now his latest book, Supercomputers, which was published earlier this year in 2024, is also a bestseller. But what I love most about it is his other story. The other half on the authorship would be that he led the team in 2013 that won the Pulitzer Prize in exploratory journalism for the Economy, a series that examined the global economy through the lens of Apple, which I really want to watch. Hopefully it's still out there somewhere. He also received the George Polk Award, the Great Loeb Award, the Investigative Reporter and Editor's Medal, the Scripps Howard National Journalism Award, and the Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Award, and so many others. So just welcome to the show, Charles.
Thank you for having me. This is such a treat.
Well, we're going to start out. I can't let you off the hook just because it's live. We do something called bullish and bearish. It's not that painful. Bullish, you're for it. Bearish, you're against it. It's going to get us started. Are you ready?
I love it. I'm ready.
All right. AI journalists, bullish or bearish?
I think probably bearish. My guess is that AI journalists are probably not going to do as good a job as human journalists, at least for things that people want to read.
Okay, fair enough. Next, a little fun. A submarine hotel, bullish or bearish?
Oh, I'd totally do that. Bullish. I would go to that in a second. That sounds awesome.
So it's funny when I ask these fun ones because people are like, yeah, I'd go in space. I'd do this. I'd do that.
Yeah, totally.
All right. And the last one, which I think is close to your heart, a robot bike messenger.
Excuse me. I would say bullish. I think that we're going to see, I mean, I don't know if it's going to be a bike messenger, but we already see those robots. Like I was in Austin and they have these robots that move up and down the streets to deliver packages. So I would say actually a robot flying messenger is more likely.
Look at that.
But I'm bullish on all of it.
Well, you know, the fun story is he lasted as a bike messenger for a day. So
yeah, in San Francisco. And it was definitely like, yeah, the hills were like, I was like, a robot would be much better than me at this.
They would survive longer, probably.
That's probably true.
Well, look, I want to jump right in because I think that why I really loved this book, Supercommunicators, The Art of a Learning Conversation, is all of us have to communicate. Right? Whether we communicate in the written word, the spoken word, on TV, in a podcast, at work, with our family, whatever, right? We all have to communicate in some way. But the story as to why you got interested in this was a self-reflection. And I think let's start there. Maybe you could give the story of your connecting with your family.
So I think so I fell into this pattern that I think probably will be familiar to a lot of people, which is, you know, I would come home from work. I was a reporter at the New York Times, and then they made me like a manager, like an editor. And I would come home from work, and I would, you know, start complaining about my day to my wife, and I'd tell her about, like, you know, my coworkers don't appreciate me, and my boss doesn't realize what a genius I am, and she very practically, she had a lot of good advice. She would say something like, you know, why don't you take your boss out to lunch, and you guys can get to know each other a little bit better. And instead of being able to hear what she was saying, I would get even more upset. And I would say, like, no, you're supposed to be on my side. You're supposed to be supporting me, outraged on my behalf. And then she would get upset because I was attacking her for giving me good advice. And literally anyone in a relationship, they know this pattern, right? This happens again and again and again. And I thought to myself, like, why is this happening? I'm a professional communicator. Like, I should be better than this. And similar things would happen at work, that I would get into the, you know, these arguments that didn't feel like they had to be arguments with other people at work. And so I called up some experts, some neuroscientists, and I asked them what's happening. And they said, well, actually, we're glad you called right now because we're living through this golden age of understanding communication for really the first time because of advances in neural imaging and in data collection. And they said, one of the things that we've discovered is when we're having a conversation, when we're having a discussion, we tend to assume that discussion is about one thing. Right? We're talking about my day or our kids' grades, where we should go to lunch. But actually, they said, every discussion is made up of multiple kinds of conversations. And these conversations, they tend to usually fall into one of three buckets. There's these practical conversations, right? Where we're talking about making plans or solving problems together. But then sometimes there's emotional conversations where I might tell you what I'm feeling, and I don't want you to solve my feelings. I want you to empathize, and I want you to relate. And then there's social conversations, which is about how we relate to each other and society and the social identities that are important to us. And they said one of the things that we figured out is that if two people aren't having the same kind of conversation at the same moment, they have real trouble hearing each other and connecting with each other. And all those different kinds of conversations, they're all equally legitimate. We all usually have more than one when we have a discussion, but we have to be having the same kind of conversation at the same moment in order for us to connect. And of course, in my case, I was having an emotional conversation and my wife was having a practical conversation. And that explains why we weren't hearing each other.
And that not hearing each other can be really detrimental, minus the personal situation in relationships, obviously, right? If you're just not communicating, relationships won't be sustainable. But at work as well. And I love the story you used because as like you, right? I love telling a story to tell the story, right? It's so much better to tell a story than be like, this is what I think. Instead, be like, here's this guy I want to introduce you to, right? His name is Felix, right? And he's an FBI crisis negotiator. And his story, I think, really opened up, immediately engaged me in the story you were about to tell me for the remaining, 200 pages, right? I mean, it really
Yeah.
got me, I'm engaged. Maybe you can tell the Felix story.
Sure. So Felix is an FBI agent who he has this kind of weird job. His job is essentially to like be a good conversationalist. So the FBI has a hostage negotiation unit. So if hostages have been taken, they send in these sort of expert negotiators. But there's a lot of situations. But when things get really complicated, they call Felix, because Felix is not just sort of a negotiator. He is someone who can kind of connect with anyone. Like there was this one case he was telling me about where this guy was locked in a room with like all these like snakes, and I can't even remember what else, like snakes and lizards. It was an animal smuggling ring, and the guy was basically like saying he was going to kill himself. And Felix convinces him to not only give himself up, turn over all the animals, but also give all these details on this animal smuggling ring. And when I asked him how he did it, he was like, well, the key was to get him to see things from the snake's perspective, because the snake's perspective was, and I was like, okay, so he's this guy. So a number of years ago, the Department of Defense, they wanted to figure out how to train military officers to have better communication skills. And so they hired a bunch of researchers to basically kind of figure this out for them. And these people asked for recommendations on who they should talk to, and someone recommended Felix. And so they get together with him, and they start just by saying, like, look, we hear you're really good at communication. Like, can you tell us what you do? And he was like, well, it'd be better for me to show you than tell you. And so he starts asking them these questions, tell me about tell me about your family. Like, do you have siblings? And one guy starts talking about his sister, or no, his favorite memory. He asks someone, what's your favorite memory? And the guy says, well, it's probably, when my sister got married, because my mom was there and it was the last time we were all together as a family before she passed away. And Felix says, he asks a couple of follow-up questions, and he says, like, that story really touches me, because one of my favorite memories is my sister's wedding, because she actually passed away from cancer, 6 years after that. And she looked so beautiful on that day. And that's how I try and remember her, is on that day. And so they chat for 45 minutes, this group of scientists and Felix. And at the end of it, everyone loves Felix. They think he's just a wonderful guy. But one of the researchers raises her hand and she says, I still don't understand what you do. Like, can you tell us what you do? And he said, yeah, actually what I do is I just asked you a bunch of questions, a special kind of question known as a deep question. I proved to you that I was listening. I showed you that I was paying close attention. I was hearing you. And even more importantly, I was processing what you were saying. And then I shared things about myself. I engaged in what's known as reciprocal vulnerability or reciprocal authenticity. And he said, and what that creates is an atmosphere of trust, that we like each other and we feel connected to each other and we trust each other because of some very simple things that I did as a communicator. And this is what we know about supercommunicators, is that all of us are supercommunicators at one time or another, right? We all have this capacity. The difference with consistent supercommunicators is that they recognize that the skills that you use in talking to your best friend, the skills that you use in communicating with your partner, they are skills that can be used anywhere, on anyone and in any setting. So you can talk to a stranger on the bus the same way you talk to your best friend, and you guys will feel close to each other. And once we identify those skills, we see them as skills, and we say, okay, I'm going to practice it once, twice, three times. It becomes a habit very, very quickly. And then we're a super communicator.
Well, I feel like there's so much in that, right? Because there's the old saying, right? That like, am I asking you a question to hear your answer so I can ask another question, or am I asking your question, right? Because I actually really want to listen and like
Yeah.
absorb what it is, and then thoughtfully think about what's my response, right? Versus
Yeah.
asking to answer, right? Versus asking to listen, right? Or asking, leading questions towards your agenda, right? Or, so I often say that I think in any communication, I don't use that communication, but in any engagement with a client, right, or a peer or a colleague, that you have to hone this skill of being a master asker. Like,
Yeah.
if you're not a good asker of questions, communication will fall apart, right? It doesn't need to be deep, like every time, like your sister's wedding, or tell me something really, personal to you, where it will expose vulnerabilities, but it still needs to be a good enough question that you're moving the conversation forward. You're establishing this communication or connection. And so you sort of identify conversations fall into one of three types. And I think
Right.
that also helps when you're asking questions. Would you mind sort of sharing what those three are?
Yeah, no, as I mentioned before, so there's the practical conversation, right,
Right.
which is about making plans. There's an emotional conversation, which is about how I feel, and then there's a social conversation, which is really about like, who are we? How do we fit into our mental construct of sort of how this particular community works?
Well, the reason I wanted you to repeat it, because then you have to match, right? Which is one of your key points, right? This matching principle of, based on, I'm guessing, right? Based on what you ask and how you ask, that you are then matching the person, right? Kind of reading the room. I mean, to oversimplify.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think, and what's important there is that it, so you had mentioned there is this thing in psychology known as deep questions, and we should ask deep questions. The name deep questions sometimes makes it sound a little bit more intimidating than it actually is, because it doesn't mean I have to ask you, like, when's the last time you cried? A deep question is just something that asks about someone's values or beliefs or experiences, which can sound hard, but it's actually as simple as if you meet someone and you ask them, what do you do for a living? And they say, I'm a doctor. Instead of asking, oh, what hospital do you practice at? Asking, oh, what made you decide to go to medical school? Right? Or do you like being a doctor? Like, what's your favorite thing about being a doctor? Those are easy questions to ask. They don't seem overly intimate or overly familiar, but what they do is they invite the other person to say something real and meaningful about themselves. And when they say something real and meaningful about themselves, we get a sense of what kind of mindset they're in. Right? I was at a meeting, this is a couple months ago, and I was sitting in a conference room, and before the meeting starts, I was just, as you do, I was like talking to the person next to me and just making conversation. And I said, "Oh, how was your weekend?" And he said, "Oh, it was great. It was great. I went to my son's graduation. It was really fantastic." And the most natural thing to do would have been to say, "Oh, congratulations. That's great. Okay, here's the agenda. Let's get down to this." But instead, what I did is I tried to match him. And matching him was as simple as recognizing that he said something that had a little bit of an emotional tinge to it. And so I said, "Oh, that sounds amazing. Like, congratulations. Like, how did you feel watching your son walk across that stage? Like, what did that feel like?" And he talked for the next 5 minutes. He loved it. He loved talking about like how proud he was and how his parents hadn't gone to college, and he saw this as like, their family improving and legacy. And and then I said, "Oh, that's amazing." I shared a little bit about myself and my family. I mean, we're talking about like 2 or 3 minutes worth of conversation here, right? And then I said, "Oh, we should probably get down to the agenda. Let's go ahead and start." But we felt much more close to each other. We felt much more trusting of each other. And it's because at the beginning of that conversation, he said something that seemed a little bit emotional, and I matched him. I asked a question that gave him an opportunity to talk about feelings. And then when I wanted to pivot to something practical, I asked his permission. I said, do you mind if we get down to the agenda now?" And he matched me in return. And this is how conversations ought to work. This is how we become aligned with one another. is when we match each other in this very genuine way.
Why do you think, I don't know if that's too broad of a question. I know that you believe that you can become a better communicator, right? If you
Anyone can become
Yeah,
a better
right?
communicator.
So
Yeah, yeah.
that's sort of you have to kind of start there. If everyone can become a better communicator, what's the journey to do that? Is it doing something that identifies where you're not a great communicator? Like, so if you say, yes, I want to improve on my communication, throughout my life, right? It could be personally and professionally. Like, so I've made a decision after listening to this amazing conversation, right? I want to be a better communicator. Charles, where do I begin?
Well, I mean, that's kind of why I wrote the book Supercommunicators, right? There's a small handful of skills that if you recognize them as skills and you practice them just a little bit, they become habits. So one of those is asking deep questions, right? If you just get in the habit of asking deep questions, just asking people, why'd you decide to go to medical school? Or, oh, what was that like? Like you went on vacation. Like, what was it like to be in that place? That's the first thing to do. The second thing to do is to prove that you're listening. So oftentimes when we are talking to someone, particularly if it's a kind of hard conversation, right? If it's something where we disagree with each other, it's very natural for both people to wonder if the other person is actually listening or if they're just waiting their turn to speak. And so getting into the habit of proving we're listening can be really, really powerful. And there's a technique for this that they teach at Harvard and Stanford, a bunch of other places, called looping for understanding. And it has 3 steps. The first step is ask a question, preferably a deep question. The second step is when someone answers that question, try and repeat back what they said in your own words. And the key here is don't engage in mimicry, because your goal is to show them that you've been paying attention and more importantly that you've been processing this, right? What I hear you say is X and Y and Z, and it kind of makes me think that maybe like the bigger issue is A, B, and C, right? So go ahead and repeat back what you heard them say, show them that you've been paying attention. And then the third step, and this is the one people usually forget, is ask if you got it right. Because one of two things will happen. The first is that I'll ask if I got it right, and the person might say, no, 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 I don't think you understood me, which is really useful to know. Or the second thing is that I will say, did I get that right? And they say, yeah, I think you understood me. And what actually happened in that moment is that I asked them for permission to acknowledge that I was listening. And when they gave that permission, when they acknowledged that, it makes them more likely to listen in response. So that's the second big skill, is to prove that we're listening. And then there's a handful of others. And again, the book is designed to teach you these different skills. But the key is that once you identify them as skills and once you practice them a little bit, because our brains have evolved to be very, very good at communication, they become habits very, very quickly. And we stop thinking about them and just sort of automatically do them.
Well, I made the assumption, right? I have listened to this conversation, right? I want to go on this journey is kind of one camp, which I believe you have to be self-aware that you need to improve in communication. I mean, right?
Yeah, I mean, yes, in general, people don't improve at anything unless they say, I want to improve at it.
Right. But, I see lots of leaders saying, I want to lead with empathy, right? I want to be more vulnerable. I want to be more transparent, right? I want to be more approachable. I want to, all these things that leaders talk about now, which I'd say, I don't know about you, but I feel like in the last decade, they talk a lot more about that than they have in the past, which I think is great. But talking about it and doing it is kind of two different things. Sometimes they talk about something and then the action is incomplete. It's completely against what they just said. Okay, I heard you say this, whatever, yesterday, last week, last month, last quarter. And now I see you behaving this way. It's so against what you've been saying, or you're not actually open to that kind of open connection, emotional connection, vulnerable connection, whatever word we want to use. And so if you're dealing with somebody who isn't open to going on this communication journey, outside of handing them a copy of your book, which may help, what would you say if someone was dealing with someone who isn't a good communicator, that you really believe they need to become a better communicator? Or what's that?
Yeah,
that
I mean, it's kind of like asking, like, what if you have someone who you think should lose weight and they don't believe that they should lose weight? What should you do? You can't do it. You can't do much, right? Like if somebody does not want to be a better communicator, there's no like magical like mind hack to make them become a better communicator. You can model the good communication, And you can bring up your concerns and say, look, I worry that you're not hearing me. Here's a
Right.
book. Like, I'd love to read this book together and talk it through. But there is no way to magically like trick someone into becoming a better communicator without them wanting to communicate. That's a
Yeah, I mean,
necessary prerequisite.
the reason I asked that question is, one of my previous guests, who's a friend of mine, Tasha Urich, talks about self-awareness, right? And 85% of people think they're self-aware when really only 15% of people are actually self-aware. So sometimes they don't know that they're not great communicators. They think they're great communicators, right? So it's that what you just said, right? Hey, this is what we talked about, and I don't think you really understood what I was saying. Let's step back through it, right? And so maybe it's right. There's something that they might not even be aware that is in fact an opportunity for improvement for them.
Well, and oftentimes there's one of two things you can do. You can a model the behavior, right? One of the things that we know is that if I start looping for understanding and doing those 3 steps, you're more likely to start doing them also, right? There's a sense of reciprocity
Right.
that's very natural to humans. The second thing is that sometimes it's just a matter of drawing attention. So like one of the questions I get a lot is, what do I do in a situation where like I'm really good at asking questions and the person I'm talking to never asks me a question back? And there's a couple of things you can do. The first is one of the nice things about deep questions is that it's very natural for us to answer our own question and it doesn't seem out of place. So if I ask you like, "Oh, why did you decide to become a doctor? Like what made you decide to go to medical school?" And you answer that question and you say, you saw your dad get sick. It's very natural for me to say, "Oh, that's so interesting. I'm a lawyer." And I became a lawyer because I saw my uncle get arrested when I was a kid. Right? So I've essentially answered the same question I just asked you, and it doesn't seem out of place. It doesn't seem like I was just waiting my turn to speak because now I'm sharing something after you shared something. But then the secondary thing is that oftentimes we're well served to draw attention in a kind of polite way to a conversational imbalance. So, I have a friend who is terrible at asking questions, and he sort of just waits for me to ask him questions. And so after a while, about 20 minutes into every conversation, I'll go, "Oh my gosh, I've been asking you so many questions. I'm sure you have a bunch of questions for me. I didn't mean to dominate by asking you questions. Go ahead. I want to give you a chance to ask me whatever questions you have." Right? And what you're doing there is you're kind of politely reminding the other person, "Oh, like actually this is a back and forth. Like you should probably be engaging in the same behavior that I'm engaging in." And I think when we think about our conversations in terms of inviting other people to be their best conversational selves, it often helps us because in doing so, what we're really doing is we're we're engaging in a little kind of meta conversation about how a conversation works, right? And nobody ever minds that, particularly if it's polite, if it assumes that the other person is a really good conversationalist and you want to give them the space to let their conversational excellence unfurl. And so these are little things that we can think about how we invite other people to be better conversationalists. And at that point, we have done what we can do. Some people just will they don't want to be good conversationalists. They don't want to have a conversation with us. And nobody is obligated to have any conversation they don't want to have, right? Sometimes you get in the Uber and you just want to check your email. You do not want to talk to the driver. And that's totally okay. No one should have to have a conversation. It's more that when you want to have a conversation, giving you the skills and the tools that make that conversation easy and successful and rewarding.
Well, and as I started out this conversation, right, it's a skill that everybody should hone in on, right? And
Yeah.
want to get better at, whether that's personal or professional, with your relationships, with your family, with colleagues, with clients, right? Connection is what this is all about, and connecting at a level where someone feels like, but I really enjoy my time with Charles. Like I feel like we have a nice connection. It might be
Yeah.
5 minutes. Like I feel like I'm his long lost friend, right? Like I feel special in that moment. Very Mary Kay, right? Mary Kay said, no matter who you are, like everyone should have a sign around the neck that says, make me feel special. And if you're good at that, you'll not only succeed in life, you'll succeed in sales, which was
Yeah.
her sort of thing, right? And so that make me feel special, make me feel important is in this connection and in this conversation.
That's right. That's right. And I think that one of the things that we know is that when we do match each other, that is when we start to feel that connection, right? There's something known as neural entrainment that happens during a conversation, which is that my thoughts begin to look like your thoughts and your thoughts begin to look like my thoughts. And this kind of makes sense when you think about it, because if I describe an emotion that I'm feeling to you, you actually experience that emotion a little bit. And if I describe an idea to you, you experience that idea a little bit. And so it makes sense that our brains would start to look alike. That's entrainment. And what we know is that the more and more entrained we become, not only the better do we hear and understand each other. I can really hear what you're trying to tell me. I can remember details from the conversation much better if we're entrained with each other. But we also just feel close to each other. That, that feeling that you get after a great conversation of like just sort of wholeness and goodness, that is a result of entrainment. Our brain has evolved to give us that sensation when we entrain with another person, so as to encourage us to connect, to make connections, and to bond with others. And so the goal of a conversation is not to try and convince you that I'm right and you're wrong, or that I'm smart, or that you should be impressed by me, or you should like me, or anything like that. The goal of a conversation is literally just to understand each other. If we understand each other, if we become a little entrained by matching the kind of conversation that we're having, then we will feel closer to each other. We will feel more trusting of each other. We will like each other more, even if we walk away disagreeing with each other.
Well, I'll give you an example. So Charles and I met, it had to be probably 12 or 13 years ago. When did The Power of Habit come out?
The Power of Habit came out 11 years ago.
Okay, so it was right then. It was sort of right
Okay.
around then. Okay.
Yeah.
At an event called The Art of in Vancouver. And I had not yet written a book, and Charles didn't know me from anyone, but I had been on stage either before or after him. So I walked up to him afterward. He was signing some books. I said, "Oh, I introduced myself." I said, I'm thinking of writing a book. And I forever remember that conversation. And I said it before we got on here live. And, it made an impact on me. Charles, I'm like, you might not remember. He's like, "Oh, I remember the event, kind of, but I remember the conversation, right? I remember the conversation. It had impact on me, right? For 5 short minutes, you gave me your undivided attention. You gave me great little tidbits of advice.
Did I give you good advice? Good.
You gave me great advice. Look,
okay,
I've got 2 Wall Street Journal bestsellers. So, you and a handful of others talked me into just going for it. But anyway, so, you never know how that quick conversation for one person, right, is really impactful. Not that it wasn't impactful to you, or, that it's that you met 150 people or 500 people that day, right? I'm not surprised, right?
Right.
But it had an impact on me. And so, that communication is super important. And I
Absolutely.
think
And I think it's probably because we matched each other, right? Because without remembering exactly the content of the conversation, is that you probably brought up something that was practical, like how do I actually write a book, or something that was emotional, like am I anxious about writing this book? It seems like a scary undertaking. And rather than just trying to kind of bulldoze through with what I want to talk about, I tried to match you, hopefully, and then I invited you to match me. And it's this matching, this is the thing that super communicators do that's different from everyone else, is they not only want to connect, it's a priority for them, they show you that they want to connect with you. Like laughter is a great example of this. Studies show that about 80% of the time when we laugh, it is not in response to anything funny. Right? You just laughed, right?
Okay,
I didn't say
funny.
A joke.
Yeah.
Instead, we laugh in a conversation to show the other person that we want to connect with them. And when they laugh back, which is very natural, they're showing us that they want to connect in return. We have a bunch of behaviors that are designed to show the other person that we want to connect. And it's when we let those behaviors kind of loose, when we give ourselves permission to show the other person, I want to connect with you, that is when we do connect. Because it's the first and most important step, is to say, I want to make a connection with you. And it helps the other person say, I'd love that. I want to do that in return.
Well, I could keep going and going and going, because I've just really enjoyed the conversation. But I want to wrap this up with one last question. So,
sure.
I've read I've read your 3 books, so The Power of Habit, Smarter, Faster, Better, and the latest one, Supercommunicators. And so I would ask you this: if now you have the 3, is there an order in which you would tell people to read the books?
Oh, no, not necessarily. Power of Habit is really about the science of habit formation, how we build and change habits. And Supercommunicators is about communication, like how we interact with others. And Smarter, Faster, Better is actually about sort of the science of productivity. Why are some people and some businesses more productive than others? And I would say the order they should read them is the order in which it seems most applicable to their own lives, right? If you're someone who really is curious about changing your own habits, start with Power of Habit. Or if you're someone who finds yourself struggling to connect with others as much as you would like, or finds you just become a manager, or you are a manager, and there's most of your conversations go great, but there's one or two that you can't figure out why they didn't go better, then start with Supercommunicators. But in many ways, the writing I do is to try and solve a specific problem. And so if folks find themselves thinking about that question in their own lives, then that's the right one for them to read.
Well, amazing. I just want to say, Charles, thank you so much. And anybody who's
Thanks for
listening
having me.
and listen to this, go pick up a copy of each of those books because they're all really great reads, great stories, great style, fun to consume. So, Charles, thank you for joining us on this episode of What's Next Live. How can people keep in touch with you and your work?
Yeah, so if you just Google me, my website is charlesduhigg.com, or if you Google Power of Habit or Supercommunicators, I'll come up, and I'm on Twitter and LinkedIn and Instagram and Facebook, all of the places. So anywhere you want, you can find me, and my contact information is all on my website.
Well, excellent. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. Once again, I'm your host, Tiffany Bova. I hope you enjoyed this episode of What's Next LinkedIn Live. Thank you. Have a great rest of your day.